The first time Ethan saw the warrior, he wasn't sure if it was dying or already dead. The alien lay motionless against the cracked hull of its own ship, its bronze-hued armor darkened by what looked like a thick, silvery fluid pooling beneath it. The battle had ended hours ago. Silence pressed against the wreckage-strewn battlefield like a heavy weight, broken only by the occasional flicker of fire and the distant hum of human search teams combing through the ruins. Ethan should have walked past. It wasn't human. It wasn't his problem. But something about the way the creature clung to life, its chest barely rising, its clawed fingers twitching as if still grasping for a weapon, made him pause. He knelt beside the alien, scanning it for signs of consciousness. It was a Mirva, a species infamous for their sheer combat prowess and unwavering pride. Humanity had only recently learned of their existence, and their first encounter had not been friendly. The Mirva had been allies of the Dominion, an empire that sought to crush Earth's growing influence in the galaxy. They had fought against humans, and now, judging by the devastation around them, they had lost. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. He had fought Mirva warriors before, seen what they could do to even the best human soldiers. And yet, here he was, staring down at a dying one, debating whether to let it slip into oblivion or intervene. The decision should have been easy. Let it go. Move on. But Ethan had always been the type to do the wrong thing for the right reasons. He exhaled, already regretting his next move. He pulled a field knife from his belt, pressed it against his palm, and made a shallow cut. Blood welled instantly, deep red against his skin. He held his hand over the Mirva's lips, letting the drops fall. The reaction was immediate. The alien's eyes snapped open, a deep, glowing violet. Its body tensed, its breathing quickening as if being jolted back from the brink. It made a sound, half a growl, half a groan, before its gaze locked onto Ethan's. There was something ancient in that stare, something calculating. Mirva physiology was still largely a mystery to human scientists, but one thing had been confirmed: their biology thrived on symbiotic bonds. Their survival depended on consuming the lifeblood of warriors they deemed worthy. And Ethan had just fed one. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the Mirva pushed itself upright. Its wounds were still present, but they were knitting together, the silvery blood thickening as if stabilizing. The creature studied Ethan in silence before speaking in a voice that was rough and laced with something unfamiliar reverence. "You have given me your blood." A pause. "Do you understand what that means?" Ethan narrowed his eyes, standing slowly. "Figured it meant you wouldn't die." The Mirva tilted its head. "It means I owe you a debt beyond measure." Ethan had no time to process that before his earpiece crackled to life. "Ethan, report in. We're wrapping up the sweep. Any survivors?" He hesitated, glancing at the Mirva. The rational part of him screamed to call it in, to turn it over for questioning. But deep down, something told him this moment was bigger than protocol. He made a choice. "Negative," he responded. "Just wreckage." The Mirva studied him carefully, as if weighing the truth in his words. Then, without another word, it extended a clawed hand toward him, not as a threat, but as a gesture of something ancient and sacred. Hesitantly, Ethan clasped it. He expected something cold, alien. Instead, he felt a warmth seep into his skin, a sensation that sent a shiver through his entire body. Then the world changed. It was subtle at first, like an unseen thread connecting him to something vast, something powerful. He felt the Mirva's heartbeat as if it were his own. He sensed its awareness, its pain, its unspoken oath. His mind blurred with fragmented images, flashes of battles he had never fought. Warriors bound by a code older than entire civilizations, secrets hidden deep within Mirva culture. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. The Mirva withdrew its hand, its expression unreadable. "You have done more than save me," it murmured. "You have become part of something greater." Ethan exhaled, steadying himself. He didn't fully understand what had just happened, but he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. And whatever he had just gotten himself into, the universe would never be the same. Ethan wasn't sure how long he stood there, pulse hammering, as the Merva studied him with those glowing violet eyes. Whatever had just passed between them, it felt like a contract signed in blood, like he'd stepped onto a path that couldn't be undone. The Mirava finally broke the silence. "I am Varish." The name was guttural, spoken like a blade dragged across stone. "You have given me your lifeblood. Now I am bound to you." Ethan's throat felt dry. "Bound? What does that mean?" Varesh regarded him carefully, as if choosing his words. "My kind do not take gifts lightly. Blood shared is blood owed. You have granted me life. I am sworn to return that debt in kind." Ethan shifted uneasily. Humanity had fought wars against races that saw them as little more than upstarts, pests to be crushed beneath the weight of galactic empires. The Dominion had been the worst of them, an alliance of species that believed in a rigid hierarchy, with humanity positioned firmly at the bottom. The war had dragged on for over a decade, humanity scraping out victories where it could, always outnumbered, always outgunned. The Mirva had been among the Dominion's most feared warriors, their biology making them nearly impossible to kill. And now, Ethan had somehow stumbled into a blood pact with one. "This debt," Ethan said cautiously, "you planning to settle it right now?" Varish's expression was unreadable, but his next words sent a chill through Ethan's bones. "It is not so simple. You have given me more than your blood." Ethan's earpiece crackled again. "Ethan, we need you back at the dropship. Now." He hesitated, knowing he was running out of time. He glanced at Varish, his mind racing. If he left him here, someone else would find him. The Dominion might still have stragglers in the wreckage, and if they found out a Mirava warrior had been weakened, they'd finish the job themselves. That wasn't how the Dominion treated failure. Ethan sighed. "You're coming with me." Varish didn't argue. He simply nodded, as if he had expected this outcome. By the time they reached the human landing zone, the remaining soldiers were loading up, preparing to leave the battlefield behind. The operation had been brutal, another hard-won victory against a Dominion fleet that should have wiped them out. But that was humanity's story, wasn't it? Always on the losing side of the numbers game, yet somehow still standing. As Ethan led Varesh toward his unit's transport, a voice cut through the air like a blade. "What the hell is that doing here?" Ethan turned to see Lieutenant Kessler stepping forward, his eyes locked onto Varesh with undisguised hostility. Kessler had been fighting this war since the beginning, long enough to know exactly what Mirva were capable of. And he didn't look thrilled to see one standing alongside his own men. Ethan squared his shoulders. "He's a prisoner." Kessler's gaze flicked between them. "He doesn't look like a prisoner. He looks like a damn liability." Ethan knew there wasn't time to explain the truth, not that he even understood it fully himself. "Command's gonna want to interrogate him," he said instead. "We might learn something useful." Kessler's jaw tightened, but after a long moment, he jerked his head toward the transport. "Fine. But if he so much as looks at one of my men the wrong way, you're putting him down yourself." Ethan nodded, ushering Varish aboard. The moment they lifted off, he felt the weight of every gaze on him. Soldiers sat stiffly, weapons kept close, as if expecting the Mirva to lash out at any moment. But Varish simply sat in silence, his hands resting on his knees, his expression eerily calm. Ethan wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the stares of his comrades or the realization that a part of him already knew he had just brought something far more dangerous onto this ship than anyone understood. The flight back to the fleet's command vessel was tense, but uneventful. The moment they touched down, Ethan was ordered to report directly to the debriefing chambers. He didn't argue. He just shot Varish a quick look before following the summons. The debriefing room was cold, sterile, the kind of place where things were decided by men and women far removed from the battlefield. Seated at the head of the table was Admiral Rains, a man known for his ruthless efficiency and zero tolerance for mistakes. Ethan barely had time to sit before the questions started. "Explain why you brought an enemy combatant onto my ship," Rains said, his voice edged with ice. Ethan didn't flinch. He was dying. "I made a choice." "You made a choice to save a Mirva warrior," Rains corrected. One of the same warriors who have spent years slaughtering our people. Ethan had expected this reaction. We don't know enough about them, he said. They're not Dominion. Not really. They were forced into this war, just like us. Rains leaned forward. You think that matters? Ethan didn't back down. I think it might. If we can find a way to turn them, to break their loyalty to the Dominion. Rains held up a hand, silencing him. He exchanged a look with the other officers at the table before letting out a slow breath. There's something you don't know, Lieutenant. Ethan frowned. What? Rains tapped a command on the console, and a holographic image flared to life above the table. It was grainy, pulled from battlefield surveillance feeds. The footage showed Dominion forces retreating, abandoning their positions, but the focus wasn't on them. It was on a Mirva warship, positioned just outside the battle zone. Except it hadn't been fighting. It had been watching. Something's changed, Rain said. The Mirva have started pulling their warriors back, refusing to engage in full-force battles. We don't know why. But I find it very interesting that, in the middle of all this, one of them just happens to form a blood bond with you. Ethan's stomach twisted. They weren't retreating, he realized. They were testing us. Rains nodded. And now we have one of their own sitting in our brig, bound to you by some kind of ancient warrior tradition we barely understand. That's not coincidence. Ethan swallowed hard. He had thought he was making a simple decision, one based on instinct. But now, standing in the cold light of the debriefing chamber, he saw it for what it really was. This hadn't been random. It had been planned. And whatever the Mirva were up to, he was now right in the middle of it. Ethan had never been the kind to believe in fate, but sitting in that cold debriefing room, watching the grainy holo footage of Mirva ships pulling back, it felt like the universe had drawn a line right through him. This wasn't a coincidence. Varesh hadn't just survived by chance. The Mirva were watching, waiting. And now, somehow, he was part of whatever came next. Rains let the silence stretch. He wanted Ethan to break first, to offer an explanation for something Ethan himself didn't fully understand. The officers seated around the table were waiting too, their expressions a mix of suspicion and calculation. Finally, Rains leaned forward, his voice measured. You still think this was just a lucky rescue, Lieutenant? Ethan exhaled through his nose. I don't believe in luck. Rains studied him. Then, instead of responding, he gestured to one of the officers, a woman with sharp, analytical eyes. She keyed in a command, and a new holo image flickered to life. This time, it wasn't battle footage. It was a star map. Ethan recognized it immediately. It detailed the front lines of the war, where humanity had been holding back Dominion incursions for the past 5 years. Except now, the lines were different. The Dominion fleets weren't pressing forward anymore. They were withdrawing. Not everywhere, not all at once, but the pattern was there. The Mirva, once the Dominion's most aggressive warriors, were no longer taking the vanguard. Rains tapped the table. We intercepted a transmission 2 days ago. It wasn't Dominion standard encryption. It was Mirva specific. Ethan's stomach tightened. What did it say? Rains folded his hands. We don't know. It was coded in a way we haven't seen before. But based on signal tracking, we know this. It wasn't a command from the Dominion. It was internal. The Mirva are talking to each other behind their masters' backs. Ethan felt a prickle at the base of his skull. The Mirva weren't just retreating. They were breaking ranks. But why? Before he could respond, the door to the chamber slid open. A junior officer stepped in, breathless. Sir, you need to see this. Rain shot him a sharp look, but the urgency in the officer's voice made him gesture for him to continue. The officer pressed a control pad, and another holo image appeared in the air. This time, it wasn't a tactical map. It was a surveillance feed from inside the ship. Inside the brig. Ethan's gut clenched. Varesh. The video showed the Mirva seated in his containment cell, hands resting on his knees, unmoving. The containment field was active, the blue shimmer of energy ensuring he had no chance of escape. But something was wrong. The lights flickered, momentarily dimming as if something was drawing power from the ship's core. The security readings alongside the video feed spiked erratically, energy surges, pressure shifts, fluctuations that made no sense. Then, Varish moved. Not much. Just the tilt of his head, the faintest shift of his shoulders. But the moment he did, the containment field flickered. Ethan's breath caught. That wasn't possible. The field was calibrated to hold creatures far stronger than humans, even species with energy-based abilities. But Varish hadn't done anything. He had simply sat there. Yet the ship reacted to him. Rain's voice was tight. "You want to tell me what the hell is going on, Lieutenant?" Ethan swallowed hard. He didn't have an answer. But deep down, he knew. Varish hadn't just taken his blood. He had done something more. And now, the ship human technology was responding to him. Rain stood, his expression darkening. This isn't just a political problem anymore. If that thing can manipulate energy fields without moving a muscle, we're dealing with something far worse than a blood bond. One of the officers spoke up, her tone cautious. "Sir, if the Mirva have some kind of technological or biological advantage we haven't accounted for." "We should have known," Rain snapped. "We should have studied them harder, broken them down, learned what makes them tick. Instead, we treated them like any other Dominion pawn, and now we're blind." He turned back to Ethan. "And you just brought one of them into our fleet." Ethan forced himself to stay calm. "We don't even know what he's doing. For all we know, this isn't an attack. It could be..." The ship shuddered. Not violently. Just a small tremor, barely enough to rattle the walls. But it wasn't normal. It wasn't turbulence, and they weren't under attack. Then the lights flickered again. Rains stiffened. The officer at the surveillance console swore under his breath. "Sir, power fluctuations across multiple decks. No known cause." Ethan felt his heartbeat pick up. He turned to the holofeed again. Varish was still seated, still unmoving. But this time, his eyes were open, glowing. A deep violet light, pulsing faintly. Almost as if he was listening to something no one else could hear. And then, without a single motion, he spoke. Not aloud. Not in any known language. But through the ship itself. The holofeed warped. Static crackled. The power fluctuations spiked sharply, sending a cascade of failed security protocols scrolling across the screen. And in that brief moment, a voice filled the room. Not from the speakers, not from Varish, but from everywhere. It was deep, layered, something old. "The cycle is ending. You do not see." But he does. The room fell into stunned silence. Ethan's breath hitched. His hands clenched against the table. And in that moment, he realized the terrifying truth. This war had never been about humanity vs. the Dominion. The Mirva were not the enemy. They had been warning them. And now, it was too late. Ethan barely had time to process the words before the ship lurched violently, throwing everyone against their seats. Emergency lights flared crimson, alarms screaming through the command center as control panels flickered in and out of operation. Officers scrambled to stabilize systems, shouting over one another, but nothing was working. The ship wasn't responding. Then, as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. The lights steadied. The alarms silenced. The tremors ceased. But the air felt wrong. It was too still, as if something vast and unseen had wrapped itself around the hull, holding them in place. Ethan pushed himself upright, pulse hammering, eyes flicking back to the holofeed. Varish hadn't moved, but his eyes still glowed, that eerie violet pulsing in slow, deliberate waves. Then, across the vastness of space, a new contact appeared on the sensors. No warning. No warp signature. One moment, there was nothing. The next, a ship. No, not a ship. A presence. The Dominion vessels that had been lingering at the system's edge vanished. No sign of battle, no trace of retreat. One moment they were there, and then gone. Erased. Not destroyed. Removed. A deathly hush fell over the bridge. Ethan could feel it pressing against his skull, the weight of something immense and ancient, something that had been watching, waiting. The holo image struggled to form a clear picture, the scanners glitching, unable to process whatever it was. Then, in the flickering projection, they saw it. It was massive. No clear structure, no recognizable propulsion system. It wasn't built. It had formed, a swirling void in the fabric of space, shifting, writhing like a living thing. Tendrils of darkness stretched and coiled, drawing in the surrounding light. And at its core, something pulsed. Slow. Steady. Like a heartbeat. A voice cut through the silence. It wasn't coming from the ship's speakers. It wasn't even heard. It was felt, a presence searing itself into their minds. You have meddled in what you do not understand. Ethan's breath caught. His vision blurred for a moment, a sensation like pressure building behind his eyes. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright. Around him, officers staggered, some gripping the edges of consoles for support, others shaking their heads as if trying to clear a fog from their thoughts. Rains managed to speak, his voice hoarse. What are we looking at? Varish answered without hesitation. The first. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ethan turned to him, heart pounding. The first what? Varish's gaze locked onto his. The violet glow in his eyes dimmed, but the weight of his expression was worse than any answer he could have given. The first to consume. Ethan's stomach turned to ice. The Dominion had never been the true threat. The war, the conquests, it had all been distraction. A game played by lesser powers, fighting over scraps while something far older and far worse watched from the shadows, waiting for the moment to reveal itself. And that moment had come. The swirling mass of darkness pulsed again, and this time, Ethan felt the ship tremble not from movement, not from damage, but from something deeper. It was being read, examined, every molecule stripped bare beneath an unseen gaze. A single thought pressed against his mind. Not words. Not a voice. Just raw intent. Consumption. And then the void moved. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. A tendril of darkness stretched outward, extending toward them, its form shifting like liquid shadow. Every fiber of Ethan's being screamed that it wasn't just reaching for the ship. It was reaching for them, for their minds, their existence. We have to move, someone shouted, but the engines wouldn't respond. The ship was locked in place, held by something beyond physical force. Rain slammed a hand onto the control panel. Weapons online. Fire everything we have. Missiles launched. Cannons roared. Lances of energy carved through the darkness. The void absorbed them all. No explosion. No impact. It simply took. Then, a reaction. Not pain. Not damage. But recognition. The presence shifted, its attention focusing more intently. Ethan felt something pulling at him, not physically, but inside his mind, as if something vast and unknowable was rifling through his thoughts, his memories, his very identity. Then Varish moved. It wasn't much. Just a slight shift of his posture. But the moment he did, the pull stopped. The air in the room changed. The ship shuddered again, but this time, not from external force. From something inside. The engines flared to life. The control panels stabilized. The darkness hesitated. And Varesh spoke. Not in human tongue. Not in Dominion standard. But in something older. Something Ethan didn't understand, but the void did. For the first time, it paused. And in that pause, a single opportunity appeared. The ship broke free. Every thruster fired at once, the force of acceleration slamming Ethan back in his seat as they tore away from the void at impossible speed. The tendrils lashed forward, reaching, but they were too late. Then, a ripple. The void did not pursue. Instead, it simply watched. Ethan barely had time to process before the ship's systems finally stabilized, alarms blaring, but the worst had passed. He turned to Varesh, breathless. The Mirava warrior's expression was unreadable. But in his eyes, the violet glow had dimmed to almost nothing. Ethan swallowed hard. "What did you say to it?" Varesh didn't answer immediately. Then, finally, "I told it that it was too soon." Ethan's blood ran cold. Too soon for what? Varesh exhaled slowly, as if carrying a weight no one else could see. For the end. The words settled like lead in Ethan's chest. This wasn't over. They had delayed it. But it would return. And next time, there would be no escape. Ethan sat in the command center, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, strategy, and something far worse, uncertainty. They had escaped, but barely. The void hadn't pursued, but it hadn't retreated either. It had simply waited, watching, as if it knew something they didn't. Varesh stood near the viewport, arms crossed, staring at the vast emptiness they had fled from. The violet glow in his eyes had dimmed, but it never faded entirely. The weight of knowledge pressed against him, knowledge he had yet to share. Rains was the first to break the silence. "We can't run forever. If that thing decides to move, nothing in the galaxy can stop it." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Then we don't give it the chance." That got their attention. The crew turned to him, some confused, others already realizing what he meant. "We need to call in everything," he continued. "Every fleet, every warship, every hidden project we've been sitting on. If we wait, we lose." A cold stillness followed his words. No one argued, but the hesitation was obvious. Humanity had weapons, secret projects buried deep in black sites across the stars, but they were contingency plans' last resorts. And this? This was the moment they had been waiting for. Rains nodded, stepping toward the main console. "I'll send the recall order. Every fleet, every ship, every system." The signal cut out. The command center went dark. For a single, terrifying moment, it felt as if it had returned, that the void had reached for them again. But then, the emergency power flickered on, and a single alert appeared on the holo screen. "Unauthorized transmission detected." The message was old, centuries old. A distress beacon from coordinates that should not exist. A sector long abandoned, written off in the official records as an uninhabitable graveyard. But the signal was human. Varesh tensed. "You need to see this." The screen shifted, lines of decrypted data spilling across the display. And then the image formed. A ship. Not Dominion. Not Mirava. Not even a modern Terran design. It was old. Very old. Black as night, its hull lined with ancient etchings, markings that predated every known human colony. And it was active. The beacon pulsed again, but this time a message followed. A voice. Rough. Weathered. "This is Captain Elias Kyle of the Black Fleet. We were betrayed. The experiment has failed. The covenant is broken. If you are receiving this, then you are already too late." The first is awake. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The Black Fleet was a myth. Stories whispered in darkened halls, a secret buried so deep even the highest-ranking officials dismissed it as legend. And yet, here it was. Varesh's expression hardened. "This is impossible." Rain stared at the transmission in disbelief. "Who the hell is Elias Kale?" Ethan swallowed hard. "He died 300 years ago." The message repeated. "We were betrayed. The experiment has failed. The covenant is broken." The words sent a chill through the room. Rains leaned over the console, trying to pull more data. "This ship, it's human. But the power source. It doesn't match anything we've ever built." Ethan's mind was racing. The Black Fleet. The Covenant. The experiment. Had humanity known about the void before? Had they tried to control it? He turned to Varesh, his voice low. "What aren't you telling us?" The Merva warrior was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, deliberate. My people were not the first to encounter the first. Nor were the Dominion. His gaze locked onto Ethan's. You were. Silence. Rains let out a breath. What? Varesh continued, his tone unreadable. Long before your modern nation. Before your Terran expansions. Before even your first war among the stars. He gestured toward the ancient ship still flickering on the display. Your ancestors touched the abyss. And they tried to bind it. Ethan's stomach turned. And they failed, Varesh added. The words hit like a hammer. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his mind spiraling through the implications. Humanity had known. They had seen the void before, had tried to control it, and they had paid the price. But if the Black Fleet had survived, if even one of those ships was still out there, then there was more to this than they understood. Rains clenched his fists. So what now? If we have some long-lost fleet out there, do we find them? Do we use them? Ethan's gut twisted. The Black Fleet wasn't a weapon. It was a warning. But before he could speak, the transmission changed. The ancient signal, once looping on repeat, suddenly cut out. Replaced by something else. A response. A new voice. Colder. Inhuman. We remember. The bridge fell deathly silent. Then, the ship's sensors exploded with alerts. The void had moved. And it was no longer waiting. The void surged forward. What had once been a distant, silent presence now moved with purpose, an immense tide of darkness swallowing the stars. Sensors screamed warnings, alarms flaring as gravitational distortions rippled across space. The first was no longer waiting. It was here. Ethan barely had time to process it before the fleet's comm channels erupted into chaos. Commanders shouting over one another, orders colliding. The plan had been simple: rally, strike, end it before it could spread further. But now, with the enemy upon them, there was no time for coordination. No time for second-guessing. All ships engage at will. Rains barked, his voice raw with urgency. Hit them with everything. The human fleet roared to life. Thousands of vessels powered forward, engines burning bright as kinetic cannons, railguns, and directed energy weapons carved streaks of fire into the abyss. The Merva ships, more fluid in their movements, weaved between the massive Terran warships, their energy lances slicing through the oncoming tide. Dominion dreadnoughts, reluctant allies at best, joined the fray, their siege weaponry thundering across the battlefield. And yet, for all their might, the void did not break. Ethan's hands clenched into fists as he watched their attacks vanish into the shifting darkness. Some projectiles struck true, detonating with bursts of light, but the void consumed them, regenerating, adapting. The first learned. It was evolving mid-battle, rewriting itself with every failed assault. Then came the retaliation. Tendrils of pure entropy lashed out, bypassing shields, phasing through armor like it was mist. Entire ships vanished in an instant, erased from reality itself. One moment, a vessel stood in defiance. The next, only empty space remained. We're losing too many, Rains gritted out, watching in horror as the Dominion flagship crumbled into nothing. Varesh's voice was tight. We can't fight this. Ethan's mind raced, searching for an answer, for anything that could turn the tide. The Black Fleet had known about this. They had fought it before, and they had left something behind. The experiment, he muttered. Rains turned. What? Ethan didn't hesitate. Get me a direct link to the Black Fleet ship. Rains didn't argue. He worked fast, rerouting power, forcing a direct connection to the ancient vessel still drifting in deep space. The screen flickered, static filling the command center. Then, the old voice returned. You should not have come. Ethan leaned forward. We don't have a choice. Tell me how you fought this. A pause. Then, the voice answered. We did not fight. We contained. Ethan's stomach dropped. They hadn't defeated the first. They had only trapped it. He exhaled sharply, mind scrambling. That meant there was a way. Something humanity had built, something old. But whatever it was, the Black Fleet had deemed it too dangerous, locking it away for centuries. "We need coordinates," Ethan said. "Now." More silence. Then, another message, this time accompanied by an incoming data stream. "There is a key. But the door has been opened too wide." The transmission cut out. But they had what they needed. Rains scanned the incoming data. "It's a facility. A Terran station, no record of it in the archives." His eyes flicked to Ethan. "Looks abandoned." "It won't be," Ethan muttered. The void was still advancing, consuming ship after ship, but there was no time to mourn the losses. He turned to Varesh. "Get us there. Now." Varesh's nod was sharp, decisive. Within seconds, the Resolute was breaking from the battle, its engines surging as it jumped into the unknown. The station came into view moments later. It was ancient, massive, a monolithic construct floating in the dark, its surface scarred by time, its power signature weak but present. Ethan wasted no time. "Bring us in." As they docked, the automated systems responded to their arrival. The station was waiting for them. Lights flickered to life. Doors hissed open. And deep within, something awoke. They moved quickly, guided by the Black Fleet's data. The air inside was cold, thick with the weight of history. Strange machines lined the walls, silent witnesses to whatever had happened here. And at the very heart of the station, they found it. A chamber. A device. It was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen, an intricate web of conduits and containment fields, humming with barely contained energy. Varesh exhaled sharply. "This is not a weapon." Ethan stepped closer. The air crackled. "No. It's a prison." A single console stood before them, its ancient interface blinking with unreadable text. But there was a command, one simple enough to understand. "Activate containment protocol." Ethan turned to Rains. "Can we link it to the fleet?" Rains was already working. "Maybe. If we boost the signal through every remaining ship, we might be able to force a localized containment field." He glanced up. "But we won't get another shot." Ethan looked back at the display. They had minutes, maybe less. His hand hovered over the command. Then the station spoke. The cost was too high before. Ethan froze. The Black Fleet's warning. They had contained the first. But at what cost? A flicker of movement caught his eye. Varesh was staring at something beyond the console. Something inside the containment chamber. A figure. Human. Or something that had once been. Suspended in the core of the machine, locked in the same stasis that held the void itself. Ethan felt his pulse hammer against his ribs. He knew what it meant. This wasn't just a containment device. It was a sacrifice. Someone had become the lock. And if they activated it again? The station's lights flickered, warning alarms blaring. The first was reaching for them, its presence pressing against the walls of reality itself. They had no choice. Ethan met Varesh's gaze. Varesh gave a single nod. Ethan turned back to the console and pressed the command. The station shook. Energy surged through the chamber, reality bending as the containment field expanded, stretching beyond the station, beyond the battlefield, beyond the fleet itself. And in that final moment, as the void screamed, the figure inside the machine opened its eyes. Light consumed the void. It wasn't an explosion or a blast of energy, but something deeper, something that unraveled the very fabric of what the first had become. The field expanded, wrapping around the entity like a net, closing over something too vast to fully comprehend. For the first time, the first struggled. It feared. And then it was no more. Silence followed. Not the eerie quiet of space, but something more profound, as if the universe itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The battlefield, once a chaotic inferno, was now eerily still. The remnants of humanity's fleet, battered and broken, drifted in the void. The Dominion's surviving ships hung motionless, their weapons offline. Even the Mirva, normally so quick to celebrate a victory, remained silent. Ethan's breath was slow, steady, as he forced himself to process what had just happened. The containment field had activated. The void had been sealed. The war was over. Yet his gaze was locked on the chamber, on the figure inside. The containment machine had stabilized, its humming now soft, constant. The presence trapped within wasn't the first, not anymore. It was something else. The human-like figure, suspended within the core, had opened its eyes. They glowed faintly, flickering with remnants of the immense power that had just been wielded. Then it spoke. "It is done." The voice was calm. Human, yet not quite. There was recognition in its tone, as if it had lived lifetimes beyond what any mortal mind could grasp. Ethan stepped forward, ignoring the static crackling in the air. "Who are you?" The figure's head tilted slightly, a ghost of something like a smile flickering across its face. "I was one of you, once. I was the key before, and now I am again." A cold weight settled in Ethan's chest. This wasn't just a machine. This was a person. Someone who had stood where he was now, who had made the same impossible choice to sacrifice themselves for the survival of everyone else. "Can we free you?" he asked. A pause. Then a slow shake of the head. "Not without breaking the lock." The containment held. The first was gone. But it was no victory without cost. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. "Thank you." The figure closed its eyes again. "Remember." The station dimmed, returning to its dormant state, as if it had only awakened for this moment. The fleet regrouped in the aftermath, repairing what they could, salvaging what remained. The Dominion, wounded but alive, withdrew to their space, acknowledging perhaps for the first time that humanity was more than they had ever understood. The Mirva, too, faded back into the stars, offering no words, only a solemn nod before their ships vanished into warp. Humanity had survived. They had won. But in doing so, they had uncovered something deeper, a truth that would never be recorded in history books, never be told in grand speeches. Some wars never truly end. Ethan took one last look at the station before the fleet jumped away.